Well, good evening. We are so pleased to welcome you. We're so pleased to welcome our speaker, who has been a real trooper. I have to thank Professor Forbath. He called us from the tarmac in Austin, Texas today and said, I'm delayed. I'm seriously delayed. But he made it. He persevered, and here he is. And he's come right from the airport to deliver the lecture. So I welcome you, and I wish you a good evening. My name is Barbara Altman. I'm the director of the Oregon Humanities Center. And I'd like to thank you for coming today. It's our 2010-2011 Colin Rowe Thomas O'Fallon Lecture, and the lectureship alternates between art and American culture. Given that we're at the law school tonight, as you've probably figured out also from the title, we're in the law year, so next year it'll be in the realm of art again. The O'Fallon Lecture was established by a generous gift from Henry and Betsy Mayer, named in memory of their nephew Colin, son of University of Oregon law professor Jim O'Fallon, and his wife, artist Ellen Thomas. This evening, we're very pleased to host Professor William Forbath. The real introduction to our speaker will come from Jim O'Fallon himself, and my remarks are just a quick preamble. Before I hand off to Jim, I want to express my appreciation to the staff of the Oregon Humanities Center. It takes a fair amount of work to organize a visit like this, so my thanks to Associate Director Julia Hayden, who now also earns Fastest Cabbie in the West honors for getting Mr. Forbath here so quickly just now. To our events coordinator, Melissa Gustafson, our communications and designer person, Peg Gearhart, and our office specialists, Lindsay Hendrickson Rogers and Jonna Ireland, for making everything happen to bring him here. While we have him in town, Professor Forbath agreed to do a 30-minute interview with me tomorrow on our TV show UO Today. And you might want to watch that conversation when it airs in 3 or 4 weeks. It will also be uploaded to the UO website, so you can get to it from your computer or you can watch it on TV. We're always happy to tell you when it's going to air, and you can find the information on the Oregon Humanities Center website. Professor Forbath said that he is willing to take questions afterwards. You'll see that there are mics in the 2 aisles. Please do come to the mics, or if you have mobility issues, we will bring you a microphone. The reason for having you speak through a microphone is because the lecture is being taped, and we want everyone listening to be able to benefit from your question as well as from the answer. And that's all I have to say for now. There's information on the Humanities Center in the front hall on the table. Our current series for this year is based on sustenance, and we have a number of other events coming up, so if you're interested in any of those, please pick up our materials. And now I will introduce, or I will pass the mic to Jim O'Fallon, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
I want to start by reiterating Barbara's remarks, acknowledging the staff of the Humanities Center. Julia in particular, who not only is a great cabbie, but is a great organizer of events. This is the 24th in this series. And one of these days I'm going to do this without doing this, but apparently not tonight. The inspiration for the lecture series was actually Henry Mayer's. And I want to acknowledge Henry in this context because he was himself a preeminent historian of the American background. His biography of William Lloyd Garrison was a phenomenally important book. Okay, can we get past this now? Professor Forbath comes to us from the University of Texas, which explains the tarmac out there in Austin this morning. His background includes an AB from Harvard, a BA from Cambridge, and JDs and PhDs from Yale. So I guess he sort of covered the waterfront with regard to that. And he is a very prominent legal and constitutional historian. One of his first and major works is a work called Law and the Shaping of the American Labor Movement. And I think that the news today from Wisconsin is that once again the American labor movement and law are running into each other as a change in the Supreme Court of the state of Wisconsin seems to have turned on people's reaction to what's been going on with the governor and the labor movement in that state. The forthcoming work that Professor Forbath is working on, it's called Social and Economic Rights in the American Grain. He's also got a book forthcoming, Courting the State, Law and the Making of the Modern American State. And what he is going to be talking to us about tonight is human rights as the 21st century's socialism. Professor Forbath?
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for staying and for being here. Thanks to Jim O'Fallon and his wife Ellen Thomas, to Barbara Altman, and her colleague, where's Julia? There she is, and Julia for coming to get me so swiftly. It's a great honor to be giving this lecture in honor of Colin, Ruagh, Thomas, O'Fallon. Legal academics may be among the last generalists in the university. We ransack other disciplines. We do law and history, law and philosophy, law and so on. So don't be surprised if this evening we dip into several disciplines, including both history and even a bit of philosophy. Don't be surprised if, really, as a generalist who sort of barely knows what he doesn't know, we stride over several continents, and don't be surprised if I make some outsized claims about the good that law may be doing in the world today. By and large, the socialists of the 19th and 20th centuries had nothing good to say about law. The law in its majesty protects the equal right of the poor man and the rich man to sleep under the bridges of Paris, right, is a famous socialist view, right? That was their view. They contrasted the formal, abstract kind of justice that legal institutions guaranteed and the real substantive justice that socialism would bring. But I want to suggest that law and lawyers and courts may be playing a large part in reinventing socialism for the 21st century, or more precisely, reinventing a particular and very modest brand of socialism that went under the name of social democracy. Social democracy is the idea that every member of society is entitled to a decent minimum of social goods like health care, housing, livelihoods. And social democracy, I think, was one of the great moral achievements of the 20th century. Never before in human history had governments made it their goal to end poverty and material insecurity among what were then called the toiling masses. Never before had governments proclaimed that everyone, every member of society, was entitled to share in all the goods of civilized life, both in practice and even in principle. Such full social membership had always been reserved for the favored portions of society. Born in the 19th century, social democracy flowered in mid-20th century Western Europe with an American cousin that went under the name of the New Deal and the Great Society. It wasn't chiefly the creation of socialists, social democracy. It was built by reformers who were both inspired and frightened by the rise of socialist and communist movements and regimes. Socialism, understood as the overthrow of capitalism and its replacement with a qualitatively, fundamentally different political economy, that socialism was, at the end of the day, a practical and a moral failure. In many parts of the world, it was a catastrophe. But social democracy was a success. And yet, by the end of the 20th century, social democracy was under attack. Its political, institutional, and even its normative bases were crumbling, and nowhere more so than here in the US, where its bases always had been thinner. You need only think of the fortunes of the phrase, the welfare state, to catch what I mean. In mid-20th century America, the welfare state was a matter of bipartisan consensus and something of which to be proud. By the end of the century, it had become something to disparage and dismantle. So today, I want to talk about the renovation of social democracy, both in theory and in practice. Simply put, I have two theses, right? First, at the level of normative theory and highbrow discourse, social democratic thinking has morphed into a political theory, right? It started as an ethical creed rooted in nationhood, right? And now it's, I'm going to suggest, a political theory rooted in constitutional democracy and universal human rights. Let's call this first thesis, which I'll unpack later on, the constitutional turn. Right? I want to sketch that sea change in social democratic thinking. And more than that, I'd like to provoke you to think about whether there isn't a pretty compelling case, a compelling constitutional case to be made for social democracy. Right? Thesis number two. At the level, so the first one's about highbrow theory, right? The second thesis is about social movement, political energy. I want to suggest the social democratic impulse has moved south to the Southern Hemisphere and the so-called Second World. And we'll call this second thesis the Southern Shift. So let's start by turning the clock back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Social democracy was the work of many generations of social reformers, all of them responding to what was called the social question, how to rescue the masses from the poverty, dispossession, and insecurity that were the results of unregulated capitalist competition. And what made the social question a pressing one was the socialist challenge, the attack on capitalist market and property relations, prompted the liberal state to embrace what were seen as socialist policies. Right? Social democracy was a compromise then between radical goals and liberal traditions. Social democrats pursued the goals of socialism in the framework of a dramatically reformed capitalism and parliamentary democracy. And as I said a moment ago, it worked. Most fully realized in Western Europe after the Second World War, social insurance, public provision of transportation, healthcare, education, and an array of other social goods, including high culture, were efforts not simply to end poverty, but to make the mass of citizenry full members of society. The idea was to provide the kind of material security and stake in the established order that would keep the industrial working class from turning too far left, right, toward the communist project of overthrowing what was called bourgeois democracy and capitalism, and to keep the middle classes from flocking to the parties of the right as they'd done in the 1920s and 30s with disastrous results. Right? And social democracy, in this sense, succeeded for a long season. Inequality shrank. The institutions of the welfare state did more than provide social goods. They created common experiences and common interests, and a virtuous circle in the sense of growing mutual trust across class differences and growing confidence across a broad swath of the population and citizenry of those nations, that high taxes were well spent. And then came a set of economic and political shocks. Right? Social democracy's most solid political base had been among industrial workers and their unions and the political parties they joined. It rested on high taxes, but it also rested on the potential of manufacturing industries to pay decent wages, right, for the working classes. And starting in the 1970s, famously, those industries began to move elsewhere than Western Europe or parts of Western Europe, and equally important, manufacturing techniques changed, and those jobs began to vanish. And the costs of social provision, which had been moving upward as the welfare state became more generous and inclusive, began to seem unsustainable. And there emerged what was called a fiscal crisis of the welfare state. At the same time, the political bases of the social democratic parties of Europe and of the New Deal coalition in the US were unraveling. Hard-pressed workers and middle classes resented the high taxes that seemed to be supporting an idle population. Racial hostilities helped fuel this resentment. And meanwhile, public discourse about the role of government in economic life was grabbed by the Chicago school economists, right? And their dramatic reaffirmation of the free market. They seized the intellectual high ground and put across the notion that free market economics and its conception of efficiency were the sole sensible tests of what the state is good for, what government is good for. Privatization and deregulation became the order of the day. And importantly, for the second chapter of the story, right, the Chicago boys, as they were called, had the most sort of free reign elsewhere than the US or the UK, where they were most influential in the Northern Hemisphere, really in the Southern Hemisphere and in Eastern Europe, where there were crises, right, of old orders and weaker regimes in relation to the centers of economic global power. There, neoliberalism, the Chicago formula, had its field day, which will bear on our story about the Southern Hemisphere. But back here in the Northern Hemisphere, the conversation about what role the state should play in public life was stripped of questions that, right, a few decades earlier had seemed to be the heart of the matter. Is this policy just? Is it fair? How will it affect the most vulnerable? Right? By the time Tony Blair and Bill Clinton rose to power, the Labor and Democratic parties and their policy mavens and intelligentsia had, right, absorbed much of neoliberalism, and they continued dismantling much of the old welfare state and privatized many public functions. It was Bill Clinton who crowed about ending the welfare state as we had known it. So by the late 20th century, here and in the UK in particular, we had become like the Grinch who stole Christmas, whose heart was one size too small. Alongside these Grinch-like neoliberal calls for dismantling the welfare state, though, there also emerged a critique from the left, right? We'll call it a reconstructive critique of the welfare state. So the women's movement, for example, had a searching set of criticisms of the welfare state. They highlighted the gendered character of the figure at the heart of welfare state policies, the male breadwinner, and his counterpart, the female child rearer and homebody. So the women's movement called for revamping the welfare state, not dismantling it, but recasting its policies to support women's equality, and this demanded a gamut of changes in order to reshape social provision and social supports of various kinds to enable women and men, too, to navigate between childcare and equal participation in the worlds of the market and public life. So, if we had world enough and time, we could take a tour of many other movements and debates that unfolded in the later part of the 20th century on the left liberal side of social and political thought, all reimagining the welfare state in a fashion, and this is what we need to underscore, that resisted the treatment and confounded the categories that the welfare state had been meting out to them. A plural, they said, we're not all male breadwinners. Some of us are not attached to the labor market. Some of us have aspirations that run to community work. Others have aspirations that go to moving back and forth between training and work. So they're always not happy on the side of the supporters of the welfare state either. It seemed too top-down, too bureaucratic, unresponsive. Its beneficiaries had no voice in shaping the kinds of social provision that they received, if they received it at all. And these criticisms, in turn, registered at the level of more general theoretical work on the normative foundations of the welfare state. This is what I will call the constitutional turn. Let me explain. Part of what pushes this turn is that the Reagan Thatcher era conservative critiques of the welfare state were not all econo-think. They weren't all about reinvigorating the free market. They were also a moral critique. They said that the welfare state was undermining individual responsibility, right? Undermining the work ethic. Racial hostility helped fuel these criticisms, but they weren't reducible to racism. They exposed a genuine moral disagreement about where one drew the line between individual responsibility for oneself on the one hand and one's economic fate, and the state's responsibility on the other. One person's decent, baseline of social assistance was another person's inducement to sloth and dependency. So the consensus, about a social democratic way of life, unraveled. And the constitutional turn was a shrewd response, among other things, to this disagreement about distributive justice and what counts as a good society. On both sides of the Atlantic, thinkers shifted the normative ground away from claims about distributive justice and the good society to leaner claims about the legal and political bases of liberal democracy. The social democratic welfare state on this account finds its justification on political and legal grounds. Let me explain what I mean. Very simply, the constitutional argument here is this. Why do we have, why do we see equal civil rights, right? Not social rights, right? We'll call social rights second-generation rights. Not because they're less important, but they came somewhat later in time as in the world of political thinking and practice. So why do we need civil rights and liberties on one hand and political rights on the other in order to have a liberal democracy, right? And these thinkers like Habermas over in Germany, Frank Michelman in the constitutional world of the US, Amartya Sen in the world of political economy, they all said we need social rights, right, for the same reason, right? That the reason that social rights are essential is not in order to have a good and decent society, but in order to have a liberal democracy, right? According to classical constitutional theory, right, liberal democracy requires public freedom, right, and private civil rights, and each constellation of rights depends on the other. So the private autonomy that we enjoy in virtue of our freedom of conscience, our security of personhood, our security of property, that's what gives us the space to think and act for ourselves in the political world, right? If we were abjectly exposed to the state in terms of our freedom of thought, freedom of expression, or the security of our homes, then how could we possibly participate in the public world as free individuals? Right? So we need private autonomy in order to enjoy public liberty. And by the same token, if we are going to be, right, in some measure, right, participants in the rules of the game in our social and economic lives, right, then we must participate, be partly authors of the rules that govern us, right? So we need political freedom in order to be able to say, that is the political equality, the equality to vote, speak out, participate in civic life, right? In order to be democratic authors of, right, the laws that govern our private lives. But the problem with liberal democracy, understood as simply requiring civil and political rights, is a gulf opens up, right, between the formal guarantees and their actual realization. Citizens must be well-fed enough, housed, and educated enough to be capable of participating in political and civic life, right? They must have the wherewithal to be and be seen as contributors to the enterprise. So we can't call on everyone to submit their fates to a democratic, majoritarian lawmaking system without also committing our society to run itself from the start in a way that ensures that everyone has access to the basic social and economic goods that enable them to be competent and respected contributors to the political exchanges and to social and economic life at large, right? This way of responding to, or excuse me, developing the legal and political justification for social democracy, right, is a way of saying we may disagree about the good society from the ethical point of view, but nonetheless, social rights are constitutional essentials simply in order for liberal democracy, right, to, right, thrive. It also was a way of responding to the critiques from the left, right? The critiques that went to the idea that the folks who were mere clients of the welfare state, right, really were entitled to a voice in the shaping of the policies and the social provision that they received. Otherwise, there was no guaranteeing that that form of welfare provision, whatever it was in any way responsive to their needs and aspirations, right? They must, in some measure, participate. That was the slogan. Those of you who are around may remember it. Maximum feasible participation was the slogan of the ill-starred community action centers of the war on poverty. Right? And they certainly had that right. So the image that emerges on this account from the work of people like Habermas or like Amartya Sen, right, is a constellation of all three kinds of rights and a world in which social provision is there from the start in order to enable even the most vulnerable and poor citizens to participate in the political and economic, so civic life of the nation. And at the same time, it loops back. It loops back and enables them to participate in what has to be a political question. There's no hammering out what our social and economic rights to basic goods should consist of, except in the political process itself. No philosopher can answer it. And at least in this social democracy 2.0 that I'm sketching, neither can elite state administrators, although that is how it worked in its first heyday in the mid-20th century. Now, my second claim, right? So that is a sketch of this thinning out, this move from the thicker sort of conception of social democracy as the good society for all Englishmen, or social democracy as the good society for all white male breadwinners in the US. It's a more plural picture. It's a picture in which much of the decision-making, right, it doesn't give you a theory with all the substantive goods prescribed in advance. It's more a vision of a politics, quite a ferment-filled politics, in which everyone's both entitled to participate in shaping the rules of the game and in shaping the forms of social goods that they're entitled to. I want to suggest now that this constitutionalized conception of social, economic rights, civil and political rights as the sort of mainstays of a liberal democracy has found expression and most sort of interesting, riveting, doing the most interesting work thousands of miles from the birthplace of social democracy in Berlin and London, right, and Washington, in places like Johannesburg, Sao Paulo, and Bogota. Right? So if everything so far has been familiar to many of you, I'm hoping that at least this second part will grab you as something new. And let me also say first that the two parts of the story are intertwined, right? That the developments in the North, right, are in a conversation with the developments in the South, the thinkers, the activists, and they're all responding to a set of world developments, global developments, that go under the same rubric of globalization and neoliberalism. All right. So nascent in these countries, and notice they're not the poorest countries of the Southern Hemisphere. Rather, they are among the wealthiest countries, but with some of the most severe inequalities. Countries like Brazil, South Africa, they have modern industries, modern mines and mills, modern agriculture, and massive poverty. That is the setting. And I want to say in this setting, a new kind of rights-based radicalism has emerged, and that it reflects some of the same dynamics that we noted in the creation of social democracy in the West, the same kind of radical ambitions and prudent compromises, the same fear of revolutionary upheaval and violence, the same kinds of, although all with important differences, but I want to paint first just the patterns that I see in common. Namely, reform-minded elites determined to wed liberal traditions with radical goals, to build social citizenship in the framework of capitalism and parliamentary democracy. Dr. King, Martin Luther King, described the rights-bearing provisions of the Civil War amendments of the US Constitution as promissory notes, and that's not a bad way to consider the social and economic rights provisions of the many new constitutions in South Africa and many countries of Latin America. All of these constitutions were crafted in the late 1980s and early 1990s. All were forged after long struggles against violent and authoritarian regimes, military dictatorships in Argentina, in Brazil, apartheid in South Africa. These constitutions aimed to consolidate democratic institutions and civil and political rights. And they also were brimming with social and economic rights, the second-generation rights that I've sketched, right? The constitutions arose in the context of economic transformations as well as political ones. This was, right, a moment when, just as the nations were democratizing, they were also seeing the dismantling of older forms of economic regulation, the demise of their versions of the mid-century model of economic development, the development state, the planning state, the strong state, right, were assailed in the name of free markets and neoliberal reforms. So there was massive privatization of industry, cutbacks in social service, an easing of import restrictions, scores of other changes that threatened the already precarious lot of the poor and working classes, even as they were being newly outfitted as democratic citizens, and in South Africa for the very first time, right? So let's zero in now and take a closer look at South Africa as one case study of this conjuncture I'm talking about. Right? Democracy, and at the same time, neoliberal reform, right? Oh, here we go. During the first 2 decades of democracy in South Africa, the keenest voices and institutional actors in the service of the dispossessed and poor of that nation was an alliance of the nation's new constitutional court and social movements of the poor and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, who represented them. It was not, paradoxically, the African National Congress, even though the African National Congress was the great movement and organization that led the struggle against apartheid and became the leading political party of the ANC. Nelson Mandela was the great leader of the ANC. But the ANC had made a Faustian bargain with neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus. So, if any of you have seen some of the photos of the great anti-apartheid demonstrations of the late 1980s, anyone remember them? They were decked out in red banners. And the red banner was the red of the South African Communist Party. Right? And when Nelson Mandela first emerged from prison, he announced that the ANC stood for equal civil and political rights for all, and nationalization of the basic industries and state direction of the economy. He had been tutored by he was not himself a communist, but his comrades in prison and in the leadership of the ANC frequently were. And he put forward the Communist Party vision of what it took to guarantee, right, a socialist republic and real equality for the citizenry. But the ANC quickly changed its tune. Similarly, and we'll see in a moment how this happens, but similarly when the great lawyer, the great anti-apartheid lawyer, Albie Sachs, right, sat down to draft the ANC's proposed Bill of Rights, it too, right, rang out with a vision of strong state control of the economy in order to eradicate the inequalities of apartheid. Right. Now, as is well known, right, at the Constitutional Convention, the ANC's leaders succeeded brilliantly in prodding the representatives of white South Africa to give up on the idea of, of a white minority veto. They would say, well, everyone will get the vote, but we white folks will have a whole set of veto points where we can veto any legislation that injures our vital interests, which of course would have made, right, a hash out of one person, one vote, and democratic majority rule. And the white representatives yielded on all those veto ideas, right? Their rights were vouchsafed by a strong court, by federalism, by a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights that actually emerged no longer talked about state control of the economy in the robust sense that these drafts had, but it was still brimming with social rights, right? At the same time, when it came to the economy, as brilliantly as they've done with respect to the Constitution, most observers agree now that the ANC, the representatives of black South Africa, were outfoxed, right, at a set of summit meetings about the economy. And the deal that was struck, right, as is often the case with constitutions, not all the important deals are in the convention. Some of them, right, are, we'll give you these provisions in the Constitution that you really want, and you commit to certain other measures in the legislative arena and elsewhere. And the agreement was that majority rule would prevail in South Africa, but that the ANC, which was guaranteed to be the leading party, the majority party by a long shot, would agree to, right, the Washington Consensus when it came to the economy. An independent central bank, joining GATT, free movement of capital, low taxes, right, and cutbacks and very great restraint in social services. So that the constitutional settlement, when you look at it whole, was very Janus-faced. It looked to Washington and the World Bank and the neoliberal consensus on the one hand, and it looked to this brimming set of social and economic promises, right, of housing, water, education, health for all South Africans, right? And what was to happen with that set of promissory notes, right, which were somehow meant to bridge the, right, sort of tugs between, on the one hand, right, becoming participants for the first time in the democracy, and on the other hand, right, being threatened to have your already precarious lot made more precarious by these neoliberal economic commitments. what unfolds is really here, right, in that space between the neoliberal realities and the hopes for redistribution and the promises of the Constitution. And let me tell you something now about the most famous of the Constitutional Court's cases involving social and economic rights, and one of the most celebrated organizations, the one that brought that suit. Treatment Action Campaign was at once a social movement and an NGO, a non-governmental organization. And it led the decade-long struggle to prod the South African government to provide life-saving antiretroviral treatment to hundreds of thousands of HIV/AIDS sufferers in the nation's public health system. And it prevailed despite the obdurate resistance of the nation's president and most of the ANC leadership. In contrast to the NAACP here in the US, right? Treatment Action Campaign, or TAC, made the polity and not the courts, right, the center of its rights claiming. Right? It raised broad politico-constitutional claims for the right to health and health care, right? Broad demands for programmatic changes and institutional innovations to take the rickety public health system that South Africa had created under apartheid for the black masses and make it into, right, an apparatus that was adequate to provide life-saving medicines for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of black South Africans suffering from HIV/AIDS. And it made narrow legal constitutional claims in the courts. But as we'll see in a moment, these were critical. Right? These were critical. It melded the new Bill of Rights with all these social rights to a grammar of protest and contention, civil disobedience, disruption, inherited from the anti-apartheid movement. Right? And it borrowed ideas about empowerment and treatment literacy from around the world. And it built up hundreds of local branches and a poor people's social movement among HIV/AIDS sufferers. And it educated them about their thinking about both the science and the medicine of HIV/AIDS in the context in which the president was, right, who was otherwise an enormously sophisticated man, was determined not to spend money on HIV/AIDS for complicated reasons we can talk about later. But suffice to say that the president, Mbeki, who had sealed the deal about a austere, right, Western Washington consensus approach to the economy, also said AIDS can be cured with garlic and beets. And it was a Western myth that AIDS was passed on sexually, right, and was responsive to antiretroviral treatment. Right? So there was much public education to be done, and a very, right, canny job to be done of finding allies inside the state, in the subnational governments, to begin rolling out these desperately needed medicines. And TAC took to court, and all these efforts were being, eventually were blocked. And what broke the blockage was a critical decision by the South African Constitutional Court. It was the first decision, still very early in the life under the new Constitution, it was the first decision in which the court ordered government to, right, reform a set of institutions in the service of one of these social rights. It ordered the government to, right, dispense not HIV/AIDS treatment for everyone, but very modest treatment to prevent mother-to-child transmission of disease. And while that was only a modest victory, right, it emboldened tax allies in government to begin to push harder. It emboldened TAC to demand more and more transparency and involvement in policymaking, right, which were other provisions of this constitutional social democracy, right? Participation, accountability, transparency, were all marshaled, which were all in the Constitution, all marshaled in the service of remaking, right, the social welfare state into something decent for poor South Africans. Right? And by 2007, 2008, 2009, right, the rollout succeeded. The threat of going back to court proved sufficient, combined with the growing mass of allies that the movement had gathered to get government to roll out HIV/AIDS treatment. Right? What evolved, and the same story, we could tell a similar story, right, about other movements in South Africa. Right? So the anti-eviction movement and the right to housing movement, a wonderfully named movement, the anti-disconnection movement, which was a movement against having your water or electricity cut off. The anti-disconnection movement, with its movement plumbers and electricians, right, who would go around, right, because there was much direct action in these campaigns. They didn't resemble the classic sort of law reform campaign of the NAACP in its early years, where everything hinged on the court victory. The lawyering and the human rights framing of the issues, right, were in the service of a strategy that was centered as much in politics, direct action, disruption, right, as other things. But what evolved was that the court came to mediate, right? The court came to mediate between the ANC's elite, the state and party elite, and the social movements of the poor and the NGOs that sought to organize and mobilize poor South Africans and their needs and hopes and rage, and to channel those and to represent those as social and economic rights claims. This popular anger, disappointment, right, was given a name as a, right, rights. Rights. What was being deprived here were your constitutional rights. All right? And the court gained something from this, and so, of course, did the movements. The movements gained enormous strategic and moral resources, right? And the court gained an international reputation, right, as the globe's most enlightened constitutional court, or one of them, breathing life into the social and economic rights provisions of that nation's constitution. We should take a glimpse, just a glimpse, before we wrap up. Right? Oh, wait a minute. Tell me, I'll wrap up in about 5 minutes, and then we'll talk. Is that okay? All right. So I want to quickly throw out another example of an even bolder court. Because the South African Constitutional Court really, in this universe of new constitutional courts acting vigorously in the service of these new rights, in some ways the South African court has been cautious. It prefers, right, narrower claims. It prefers to prod government to be transparent, to be accountable, to justify its policies where they're said to fall short of what's doable in the realm of social provision, and to prod them to listen to the voices of the vulnerable South Africans, but not to, in the fashion of the Indian Supreme Court, or even of our own Warren Court in its salad days, not necessarily to take over whole institutions and decree how they should be reformed and specify in the way that, say, the Indian Supreme Court specifies, here's what each child in India should have for lunch, and ordering lunches in every school in India, right, for the poor. Because those orders, as the South African judges will tell you, are usually more than half defied, and the South African court wants its decrees obeyed. It wants the elusive distinction between what's law and what's just policy and exhortation to be very clear. When we say something is law, it's law, and so it prefers to have the heavy lifting done elsewhere and to catalyze that heavy lifting. And it can afford to do that because, right, South Africa does have today very secure civil liberties and freedom of speech and association and robust social movements and NGOs. Colombia, famously, has been the scene of 5 decades of civil violence. The government has, right, still managed to obliterate civil society and the space in which social movements can thrive. And so it has an even more assertive constitutional court. A canny judge named Jose Manuel Cepeda, who's managed to, for example, take hold of the whole Colombian public health system, right, and do what Treatment Action Campaign, my friends at Treatment Action Campaign, are trying to do in the polity, in the name of human rights. The Colombian Supreme Court has ordered that the private and public sectors of the health insurance system be merged. That government come up with a plan to wed the health service system for the poor Colombians and the rest in order that they may be more equitably, right, united, right? So there where there's a deficit of NGOs, the court has taken an even more aggressive role, right? So let me sum up. Right? We are obviously worlds away from the Southern Hemisphere. Right? And my first object, right, is not a prescriptive one, but as a kind of historian of the present and the past. I want to hope that my sketch, right, might persuade you that some of the same kind of dynamics that brought forth social democracy, 20th century style, are afoot in the Southern Hemisphere, bringing forward a project that's similar. Still a fragile project, right? And one whose, right, main actors and proponents, right, look quite different, but one that reveals some of the same kind of dynamics that I, right, described to you about the 20th century version, right? The old social democratic reformers of the 20th century, right, had no use for courts and little use for lawyers, and they'd lament the very notion that building social democracy could depend on law. They were administrative state builders, they were party builders, they were trade unionists, and they had great faith in those institutions. And all of them remain indispensable today. But making them responsive to the poor and vulnerable and dispossessed, making the administrative state or even the union movement truly pluralized in the way that this social democracy 2.0 demands, responsive not only to men but to women, responsive to ethnic minorities, responsive to gay and lesbian and transgender people. We have a more dispersed, and to that extent, right, weaker set of forces pressing for serious redistribution. Right? We don't have industrial working class of male white workers, right, with their one singular vision of redistribution and the good society. If we did, we could perhaps still have an old-fashioned social democracy with top-down administrative, right, elites shaping everything in the way of redistribution in one mold. Instead, I'm evoking, right, a more constitutionalized, more lawyered in the sense of there's accountability, there are hearings, you have to provide reasons, right, you have to let us participate. We need the courts to prod these institutions to be transparent and open and engage with the most vulnerable of us. Right? And I think the pressure to do that is greatest in the Southern Hemisphere, where there is, in those countries where there's great wealth and desperate poverty, and masses of people in desperate poverty. And so it is no surprise that the elites show a surprising degree of gingerliness and don't shut these courts down. Because the courts are, after all, keeping these potentially explosive conflicts on the civilizing field of law to some extent. So it's not a surprise that they abide with them. And they may end up just being the kind and gentle face of neoliberalism and not something transformative. That's the other possibility. But I submit that it is, for now, the last best hope of social democracy, and that it is not such a great world apart from where the US may be heading. Right? One can imagine, right, a US, right, if the economic elites and government don't create, right, a broader base of decent work for Americans, if class inequalities just continue to grow, if American workers and middle class come to fear the future more and more, and racial and ethnic scapegoating burgeon, right? And if, right, the growing underclass that we have created is policed in ever more vicious ways, one can imagine emerging in the United States what some pundits call a friendly fascism, a deeply authoritarian America. And I continue to think that the best safeguard of liberal democracy against this friendly fascism remains social democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we welcome questions.
Honestly, how confident are you about the sustainability and durability of the movements you talk about in the Southern examples? Honestly.
Honestly, I think they are, the movements, I'm not, I'll be honest, if we're specifically about South Africa, I feel more confident about the movements than about the court. And it's not because the court was pressing so hard on social and economic rights. It's because the court had the gumption to weigh in against Zuma, the new president, in respect of a criminal case, just plain old corruption. But Zuma, the new president, I think they're in a rough moment. The old South African Constitutional Court were heroes of the anti-apartheid movement. Albie Sachs, whom I mentioned in passing, Cato Reagan, these were all great lawyers and great radicals. An amazing kind of combination of the two. And Zuma, Jacob Zuma, the present president, has managed to get his hands on the appointments process and appoint a handful much more mediocre and less courageous judges, more submissive to ANC, pressures. So that's a worry. I think that the movement of the poor in South Africa, the ANC, I don't think it'll try and harness those movements. It's not going to suppress them, right? It still has too many veterans of the anti-apartheid movement, people who are committed and who see themselves as devoted to the dispossessed of South Africa, to violently suppress those movements or arrest their leaders. That may be a vein, I may be too optimistic, but I think the court and its activism may be in for a season in the shadows. And then the challenge will, for the ANC will be to develop, to nonetheless be responsive. I think they'll muddle through, and that I'm hopeful, but not that optimistic, that another generation of great judges will sort of emerge. Elsewhere, like in Latin America, I think that Brazil is on a sustainable path. And I think that Colombia is a much more shaky situation. But Colombia is a land of incredible contrast, where you can have all this violence and yet great experiments, and sort of very civilized experiments and democratic innovation at the same time. And the court responded to the civil violence, did I mention this, and ordered government to provide, under the rubric of social and economic as well as civil rights, to provide for 5 million internally displaced persons. And the court really set itself up as, we've got a dysfunctional, sort of completely broken up administrative state. We, the court, are going to orchestrate putting it back together. And so far, they've gotten buy-in from enough players in government to abide with them and participate in this rebuilding the state under the aegis of the court. But that could all unravel.
Katie, should we go to the microphone or should we just stay here?
Could you go to the microphone if you would, please? I'd appreciate it. Or else we could ask Professor Forbath to repeat the question before he answers.
I'm happy to do that.
I'll go to the microphone.
All right.
That was a great talk. I have to say, I'm one of those who doesn't know anything about what's going on in South Africa, so I found that very helpful. But I did want to ask about the first claim or set of claims you made. So as I understand it, what you're talking about is not just the notion that certain economic issues, which used to be just sort of made as demands about abstract justice or good society, are now being interpreted as constitutional essentials. Further point that that's related to a theory that you mentioned, articulated by people like Habermas, that the importance of those constitutional essentials is because they are prerequisites for having a robust democratic society in general. The second view, I think, is a very interesting theory and one that's been around for a long time. I just don't think it makes any difference to anybody. And so let me give you an example of something I'm experiencing now, which would be my evidence of it. I now teach most of the year in the United Kingdom, and what they're having right now is a serious debate about Cameron's perceived attack on the National Health Service. Now, this is the fundamental social right of a citizen, and it's interesting to me how the debate is proceeding, because it's not proceeding as we need to have health care because that is a precondition of a more generally robust liberal society. In fact, if someone brought that up, they would probably be told that's why we hate Tony Blair, is because that's third way thinking that has been completely, utterly discredited. It's being actually articulated in class terms. This is what happens when you give rich people too much power. Now, as someone who has a fondness for that framework, and actually thinks that that's usually the best place to start out with. It sounds to me from what you're saying that you're enormously sympathetic with that general framework, but the other time it sounds as if some of the discourses you're endorsing seem to pull us away from that. So I'm just wondering about how that tension works out.
Okay, everyone heard the question. It was a subtle question, or it wasn't. It was a blunt question. It was blunt and subtle. So why not just talk class warfare, right? Why all this sort of, we are all part of a liberal democratic community and their prerequisites, we owe one another, and so on. I guess I was trying to talk, I'm not sure class warfare as such is a normative theory. Or if it, in other words, I was saying what's going on in the normative sphere, not the most, and I guess what you're saying is, why not go back to a certain kind of distributive justice talk? This is just unfair. They have too much, we have too little. Right? That's the normative way of putting
I guess also I'm just saying that it seems as if that's what's happening. And so I'm not sure exactly what the force of that is, except that at a certain point, the question of political discourse is, does it engage people?
Right.
And I just think that it's interesting to me, quite frankly, to some extent, that it doesn't seem to, because it seems as if it should.
Yeah. I think that people, that it's better to have a war against the rich than, look at what the war against crime has brought us, right? That's a war on the poor. So given that, if we need a war, and there is something in the, human spirit that seems to want wars, and sort of a war on terrorism, a war on crime. I like the war on poverty better, right? So so in a sense, yeah, if there's great maldistribution, then distributive justice claims they have too much, we have too little, maybe more resident. And I was partly describing, just what goes on somewhere in that space that includes constitutional law and political theory, and it was a descriptive claim about how the defenders of the let's privatize medicine and everything else crowd they had traction too. And the aim of these fancy theorists was to see if there was some way of getting out of that disagreement onto some ground where, it's hard to disagree. But I take your point, and there it is. There it is. Yes.
Do you have any confidence in our current top court to breathe life into our own Constitution, and in terms of enhancing human rights in this country? I'm thinking specifically of gay marriage and universal health care.
Right. I think that there's some. I have no universal health care out of this. I don't have confidence in any Supreme Court in this country producing universal health care. I can see a liberal court, a court fortified, if things unfold in a liberal direction as opposed to a reactionary one, I can see a future court 15, 20 years from now filling in the holes of a healthcare system, saying this is unfair, this is irrational, when there are all kinds of constitutional tools, even in our constitutional tradition and text, that one could use to make more generous and fair and inclusive a healthcare system. That I can see in a liberal direction. But bringing it into being whole cloth without a right to health in the Constitution, I don't see happening. I think that in the political space, it's a crying shame that there's been all this constitutional energy against the Affordable Health Care Act, right? So there is a right-wing constitutionalism The right sees this as a deep constitutional turning point. That this is the dawn of socialism, because it's every American is being compelled to pay by insurance. You know the story. The Tea Party sees it as a constitutional moment, and I think in a certain way it is. There is at least a principle, very meager in its actualization, but a principle that everyone is entitled. But the left and the liberals, for all kinds of strategic reasons that I think are too clever by half, aren't making the constitutional case in the polity that everyone's entitled to this, right? I think that will come. So I guess in the political sphere, I am sanguine that may come in the political sphere, that there is a right to this. And then over time, it becomes a fundamental interest in our constitutional law. As regards gay marriage, I'm more sanguine about that than about any soon-time announcement of a right to health care from the court. I think that as so many things do, everything depends on Justice Kennedy. And I think that, that one can easily sort of imagine a justice, I think it's at least 50-50, that if it finally comes to them, and there are a lot of standing issues and issues that might kind of cause it to somehow just stay in the Ninth Circuit. But if it comes to Supreme Court and the present justices are there, I think it's 50-50. What do you think? I think you could see Kennedy saying the nation isn't ready for a national court to decree that this is what the Constitution demands. And when I said in Lawrence that this doesn't extend to marriage, I meant it. I can also see him saying he does, that the spirit of Lawrence the spirit of Lawrence requires this. Yes.
I'd be interested if you could make any observations about similar tensions between courts and NGOs in any Muslim majority countries or Asian countries.
That is a great question. This whole vision of the question was, what about Muslim countries? What about countries in which much of social provision, as a matter of fact, right, is a project of the mosques, of the, I'm not sure if that's what you had in mind in particular, but the whole question of what welfare provision and social provision is going to look like in this century. Where's the energy going to come from for it? And how are deep inequalities going to be mended? Clearly, in many Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, many different Muslim movements get their traction from being the only reliable social service providers for the poor in those nations. I don't know anything about it, is the answer. And how they interact with the courts or the Constitution, don't know, but it's a good question.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah.
Your discussion of the relationship between political organization, the streets and the courts, it sounds to me like one might usefully set that against a rule of law justification and basis for expecting courts to accomplish something. Is this a different kind of base for judicial action, or does it not make any sense?
So I think the courts, I think that I think that for courts to do some of this kind of work, you have to soften the distinction between law and politics in some degree. They are making contestable value judgments, political choices, filling in the meaning of open-ended rights guarantees. And particular, so it does to some extent blend with the broader politics. So in that notion of a rule of law in which has crisp and firm meaning that the judges don't impart to it, and that the judges are not willy-nilly and inescapably channeling political voices, right? You know, Justice Scalia is channeling the, you know, right to bear arms movement, right? And you can see that, you know, we don't have any longer anyone on the court who's channeling left constitutional movements, but I do think that all throughout our history, there's been a, you know, give and take between arguments that, you know, on the streets or in the media, on the blogosphere now. You could read big chunks of Scalia's Second Amendment right to bear arms opinions a decade or two before they appeared in the, you know, literature of the NRA. So there is, and I don't think, I disagree with him in substance, but I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. And I don't think it's inconsistent with a commitment to certain rule of law principles and values. I think that the South African Constitutional Court leaned so heavily on process remedies, rights to hearing, rights to transparency, rights, you know, that government has to be held to account rather than the court constructing the policies themselves, because it's interested in a certain rule of law vision, and that this is the office of the court. But I'm not sure. I think we need to have a longer conversation to sort of unpack what you meant. And this isn't the evening for it. You all waited for me long, and now I've kept you a long time. I could go on.
Thank you very much. I think that we need to let you off the hook.
Sure, I'm happy to. I'm jazzed, so you
I just wanted to return to Cheney Ryan's comments regarding the descriptive accuracy of your first thesis.
Right.
And try to tease that out a little bit
Right.
more. So I took it that the claim of the first thesis was that political rights generate social entitlements, because social entitlements are necessary to discharge political rights. And I see how that claim makes sense with regards to situations like that, which you described in South Africa. But like Cheney, I wasn't clear on how that constitutional turn thesis applied well to the evolution of liberal democracy in 20th century states like the United States and England. One way to frame my concern is in terms of the banner under which you floated your argument was, and your argument was an argument about liberal democracy. And that puzzles me, because the claim you're making is that a robust sense of political participation requires social entitlements. But I don't take it to be part of liberal theory and liberal practice that we always already endorse the importance of political participation. I take that to be an ideal that's more part of the tradition of thinking that political theorists like to call civic republicanism. And that kind of thinking is going to arise in moments in which you tend not to have strong support for a state. So moments like Germany after the war, moments like the Reconstruction era in the United States, moments like the South Africa situation. But if you've already got sort of strong national solidarity built up and running, your worry isn't going to be to secure political allegiance in the sense of civic republican ideals of participation. Rather, you're going to want to secure consent to a state in a liberal kind of manner, according to which participation isn't the end goal, but securing political individual rights against the state is going to be the kind of goal. So to try to tie these loose threads together, the worry is that as a description of US politics over the 20th century, your argument might not work if we don't already have buy-in about the importance of political participation. In other words, if we really are a liberal democratic state and not a civic republican polity, then liberalism is going to require of us that we generate additional norms of equality in a sort of moral sense, a distributive justice sense, over and above the political rights that we have as liberals. So I wasn't sure if I mean, if you agree with what I'm saying theoretically, and B, I wasn't sure if maybe your claim was that in addition to there being a constitutional turn in the U.S. in the 20th century, we've also evolved from a liberal state to a more civic Republican state.
Right. I get the question. It's a good question. I'll try, and it opens onto a pretty long and interesting but complicated conversation. But I'll try to just sketch a quick answer. I was not laying great emphasis on the civic Republican vision of active participation as the premise on which I think a lot of these thinkers are resting the idea that social rights are prerequisites for liberal democracy. So I think it's a much more simple and liberal as opposed to Republican conception, which simply says, why do we call on people to, how can we say people have consented to laws with which they deeply disagree and which they think screw them, but nonetheless they are obliged to obey them? This is not a Republican question, this is a liberal question about we say that because they have a fair opportunity, right, to participate in the process out of which the laws emerge, right? That is what it means to talk about the consent of the governed, just in a liberal democratic sense, without any Republican infusion. And then the next turn in the argument is simply, are we serious? Right? Can we say that with a straight face? Right? That everyone has signed on to the social contract in that sense, if the system, right, is so designed as to ensure that some significant number of them will live in abject poverty, right? Without education, without a decent, right, clothes to wear, to engage not in some civic Republican, right, sort of sustained citizen thing, but just simply is one a charter member of this contract if one is put in that position in the way that the system, produces and reproduces the laws that govern the, competition and cooperation in the economic and social world, right? That it's what who is it? I think Jeremy Waldron calls, sort of that strains consent, right? It's too much of a strain on the idea of liberal consent. So I think that set of moves is part of what I would respond to that you can have a much thinner notion of consent and the fair value of liberty, in the sort of Rawlsian sense, and say in order for this scheme to be plausible, we have to be committed from the start, what I said before, to run it in such a way that people are equipped. It doesn't have to be for active civic participation. It may just be to go out, and have a fair shake, at the employment office. To fulfill one's obligation to be an economic agent in the society and responsible for oneself, one needs some wherewithal. So I think one can have a thinner, more distinctly liberal take on these things.
Yeah, I think we'll end with that. Thank you so